Some drawings, once committed to paper, refuse to remain there. They continue their work. The one this narrative concerns was produced in a single session inside a sheriff's office in Lamplet, West Texas, during the autumn of 1867. Since then, no one who has studied it has been able to say with certainty what it actually depicts, and anyone who tries tends to change their answer later. Before I lead you into that office, before the ranger, the sheriff, the 47 days, the 9 figures on the page, I want you to do one small favor for me. Tell me where you are tonight, not the full address, just the state, the country. If the wind is stirring outside, mention that too. Put it in the comments. It matters to me to know where these old tales are being heard. And a note before we begin. If the kind of case I tell here is something you'd want more of, not just 1, but 10, each delivered in full, in a voice made for the dark, there is a collection called What the Mountain Keeps. 10 files from 10 counties, 5 states, spanning 1893 to 1955. Every one of them walked into terrain that looked easy, and everyone was signed off by the law with the wrong word. 10 hours to sit with in the dark, from start to finish. The link is in the description and pinned at the top of the comments. Now then, the town was called Cinder Wells. You won't find it under that name on any map today, and you wouldn't have located it easily in 1867 either. It sat in the far reaches of what men then called the Trans-Pecos country, a dry open palm of land west of the Pecos River, north of the Rio Grande, and a very long way from anyone who was going to come to your aid. Cinder Wells had 6 standing structures on its main street, a telegraph office that had lost its wire twice, a church with no bell yet, a general store, a blacksmith who also worked as a cooper, a saloon called the Widow Lantern, and the sheriff's office, 1 room deep and 1 room wide, with a cell attached that had been used over the years, mostly for men who drank until they wept. There was also a well, that is where the name came from. The water was dark at the surface and clear at the bottom. If you drew it up at dawn, it tasted faintly of iron and ash. If you drew it up at dusk, it did not. The sheriff was Cassius Whitaker, 61 years old that autumn, a broad, slow-moving man with a face that had gone from tanned to weathered to something like leather someone had folded and refolded many times. He wore his hair long because he had never bothered to cut it after his wife died in '53, and he wore his badge over the second button of his coat because he had once been shot at the first. He was not a fanciful man. That will be important. The disappearances began in the spring of 1866. They came slowly at first, then not slowly. The first man was named Amos Trethway, a freighter. He drove mules between Cinder Wells and a supply depot 2 days east. He had been making that run for 11 years. In April, he did not return. His mules did. They arrived at the edge of town at first light, still hitched to the wagon, still standing in formation. So motionless that the boy who found them thought at first they were carved from wood. The wagon bed was empty. Trethway's coat was folded neatly on the driver's seat, his pipe still packed, his hat hanging from the brake handle by its cord, and a pair of boots he was known to wear were placed heel to heel on the floorboard. Nothing else, no blood, no signs of struggle, no prints in the road behind them long enough to indicate where he might have stepped off. Whitaker rode the route himself. He rode it for 3 days. He found no one. He found nothing that had once belonged to a man. He recorded it as a probable death by exposure. He kept the coat and the pipe in a drawer. 6 weeks later, Silas Merrick, who cut stone in a small quarry east of town, walked out toward his work at dawn and did not walk back. His pick was found leaning against the quarry wall, freshly sharpened, nothing else. Then in July, Obadiah Fenn. Fenn was a Methodist circuit rider, 34 years old, a preacher with a saddlebag full of pamphlets and a habit of writing his sermons into the margins of the pamphlets he had already given away. He was riding a circuit that took him to 3 ranches over the course of a week. He never arrived at the first one. His horse was found at the second, still saddled, still calm, still eating from a feed sack that had been carefully set out on the ground for it, as if placed there by a considerate hand. By the end of that summer, 5 men were gone from the country around Cinder Wells. By the end of the year, 7. By the following spring, 8. Nobody screamed, nobody left signs, nobody was seen walking away. That last part was what began to trouble Whitaker most. In a country as flat and as vast as that one, a man going somewhere is a visible thing. You see him for miles. You see the dust before you see him. And every one of those 8 men had at some point been headed somewhere. And yet nobody on any nearby ranch, in any nearby settlement, on any road within 20 miles had seen them en route. They had simply stopped being anywhere. He wrote to the state. The state in 1867 was finding its shape again after the war. The ranger companies had been dissolved during the Confederacy, folded into other kinds of work, and were now being reassembled piece by piece in whatever fashion the Reconstruction government could manage. Requests for a ranger did not always find one. When they did, the ranger who came was often a man of a particular kind. The one who came to Cinder Wells that October was Ephraim Kilburn. Kilburn was 44 years old. He was tall in a way that made you notice him before you saw him, if that makes any sense. It was not that he was much taller than other men. It was that he had a way of standing which took up more of the sky than his body should have. He wore his hat low. His hair was already gray at the temples. He had gray eyes of the sort that never quite settled on you when he was speaking, and a scar that began at the corner of his mouth and stopped just under his left ear. A scar he had received, according to the 2 stories he ever told about it, either from a knife or from a wolf, depending on whom he was talking to at the time. He had ridden as a scout in the war. Before that, he had lived for some years in the country north of the Red River with people who were not his blood. He knew how to read a piece of ground the way a preacher reads a page. He knew where a man might have knelt to drink, where a horse had lain down for the night, where a rock had been moved and put back not quite in its old spot. He rode into Cinder Wells on the afternoon of October 3rd. He did not speak to anyone in the street. He rode directly to Whitaker's office, dismounted, tied his horse himself, and knocked once. Whitaker opened the door and said, "You're the ranger." Kilburn said, "I'm the one they sent." That was the beginning of it. They sat together in that one-room office for most of 2 days. Whitaker had by then prepared everything he could prepare: the names of the men, the dates they had gone, the places they had last been seen, the things that had been found after them, laid out in the drawer in a careful order, each item labeled in his own hand. Kilburn went through the drawer once. He did not touch anything. He went through the papers twice. He asked questions in a voice so low that Whitaker had to lean toward him to hear the answers. Where was Trethway coming from? Where was Fenn going? What time did Merrick usually reach his quarry? Did the mules act sick when they returned? Did the horse act sick? Did the coat smell of anything? Whitaker answered as best he could. Where he did not know, he said so. That more than anything was what Kilburn wanted to hear. He did not like a man who invented answers when he did not have them. He said quietly at one point, "A man's memory will fill in every hole with a piece of the wrong shape if you let it." On the second afternoon, Kilburn stood up, walked to the map Whitaker had pinned on the wall, and stood in front of it without speaking for a long time. The map showed the country between the Pecos and the Rio Grande. It was the map a surveyor had drawn in 1859. It had a lot of blank places where the surveyor had never gone. Kilburn pointed at one of the blank places. He said, "There." Whitaker said, "That's nothing. That's just where he ran out of paper." Kilburn said, "That's where I'll go first." The blank place he was pointing at was about a day's ride east and slightly north of town. It was a stretch of low, broken country between 2 dry watercourses, both of them called at the time by names that had already begun to slip out of use. The people who had once given those names had by 1867 been mostly pushed further west, and the settlers who lived in the region did not use the names. And so the names were fading in the way names do when nobody has any reason to hold on to them. The country in there had no roads worth calling roads. It had a few tracks worn by cattle and by the men who followed the cattle. It had one stand of cottonwoods along one of the dry courses and one cracked, sun-bleached rise of low stones that some travelers used as a landmark. Otherwise it was open scrub, mesquite, ocotillo, wide flats of gravel and hard-baked clay. There was nothing there. That was what everyone said about it. Kilburn rode out on the morning of October 5th. He took on his horse provisions for 2 weeks: a tin of coffee, a packet of hardtack bacon, a little sugar, powder and shot, a canteen, a blanket, a knife, a small cloth-bound notebook, and a stub of pencil. He did not take anyone with him. He said to Whitaker at the door before he mounted, "You will not send anyone after me." You will not come after me. You will wait. Whitaker said, For how long? Kilburn said, Until I come back. Then he added quietly, in a way that Whitaker later said had the shape of a small joke but only the shape, or until you stop expecting me to. He turned his horse. He rode east. He did not look back. The last person to see him alive, or so people later said, was a woman named Loretta Vance, who kept a way station at a spring about 6 hours east of Cinder Wells. Kilburn stopped there on the afternoon of the 6th. He watered his horse. He bought a small paper twist of sugar for his coffee. He sat on Loretta's porch for the better part of an hour, not saying much, watching the country to the east. Loretta, telling the story later, said Kilburn had asked her only 2 things. The first was whether she had heard any strange sounds coming from that country at night over the past year. She said she had not. Kilburn nodded and did not press. The second was whether she thought the hills moved at night. She said at first she thought this was some kind of ranger's joke. She laughed and said, well, they hadn't when she checked last. Kilburn did not laugh. He said quietly, You would not know if you were the one who was moving. Then he thanked her for the sugar, stood, put his hat on, and rode off. Loretta said that as she watched him go, she had the strong feeling, which she could not have explained if you had asked her to at the time, that she was watching a man walk into a room and shut a door behind him. 2 weeks passed. Whitaker was at that point still confident. 2 weeks was reasonable. 2 weeks was, in fact, what Kilburn had gone out prepared for. 3 weeks passed. Whitaker began to sleep less well. 4 weeks passed. Whitaker composed a letter to the ranger headquarters in Austin. He did not, in the end, send it. He wrote it out 3 times, and each time set it aside because he could not quite bring himself to write the word missing beside the name of a man who had specifically told him not to come after him. In that 4th week, a 9th man went missing. His name was Micajah Pruitt. He was a horse trader who worked a wide loop between 3 counties. He had left his home at dawn with a string of 6 Mustangs he had bought off a Mexican rancher and was leading them that morning towards Cinder Wells. The Mustangs arrived that evening. Pruitt did not. The Mustangs had been led, at least for the last stretch of their journey, by someone. They had not been driven, they had been led. Because when the boy at the livery caught the lead rope of the first one, he found that the rope had been tied off at the other end to nothing at all. The rope simply ended in a knot, and the knot had been recently tied. Whitaker put on his coat and walked out to the livery and looked at the knot for a long time. And then he walked back to his office and sent the letter to Austin. The letter said in part, I have lost my ranger. I have lost another man. I have never in my life felt as watched as I feel in this town this month. I ask for anything you can send. The reply came a week later. It said, Wait. It said in the 2nd paragraph that Kilburn, when he took a case, was not to be interfered with. That he had been reported missing 3 times in his career and had come back on his own each time. That the state understood the sheriff's concern, but that the state's concern was at present elsewhere. It said in the end, We will send another ranger in the spring. Whitaker folded the letter twice and put it in the drawer with the pipe. Let me pause for a breath here, because if this is beginning to sit under your ribs, I want to say 2 things. The first is that if you have ever, in a quiet room, felt the certain unshakable feeling that you were being watched, and then turned to look and found nothing, I want to know about it. Tell me in the comments. A time, a place, what the room looked like, what the air felt like. I read them. The second is this, and I will say it once and go back to the story. If this is the kind of case you'd want to sit with in the dark, not just hear it once, but keep it, there is a collection I put together with the people at Forbidden and Unresolved Stories. What the Mountain Keeps. 10 complete cases, 8 hours, 62 years of records nobody wanted to finish. Every one of them placed, dated, and signed off with a tidy word that never once fit what happened. The link is in the description below and at the top of the comments. And if you're new here and you have not yet subscribed to Macabre Story, this is where I ask you to, so the algorithm keeps bringing these old files to your ear instead of hiding them. If you're listening to this on a channel that is not called Macabre Story, that is not us. Somebody has taken it without asking. Let us know. Let's go back to it. 47 days after Ephraim Kilburn rode out of Cinder Wells, he came back. He came back on foot. It was the morning of November 20th, 1867. He was found on the west edge of town at first light by a widow named Ida Kepler, who lived alone in a small house at the end of the wagon road, and who was on that particular morning walking out to feed a stray dog that had been sleeping under her porch. She was going toward the road with a piece of bacon in her hand when she saw a man standing very still in the middle of the road, facing town, not moving. She said afterward that at first she did not recognize him. His coat was in ribbons, not torn, not shredded, but ribboned in the way that thin strips of cloth will hang from a garment that has over some long time been pulled at by many small hands. His boots were worn straight through at the soles, and he was standing, she said, as if he did not quite know he was on the ground. She said, "Ranger." He did not turn. She said, "Ranger Kilburn, sir." He turned then, but he turned in a way that, she said, made her step back off the road and into the tall grass. He turned, she said, in stages, his shoulders first, then his hips, then his head, as if the turning had to be worked through one part at a time. She said she had once seen a paper doll articulated with brass pins, and that this was what he moved like. His face, when it faced her, was empty of expression, but his eyes were tracking very quickly as if reading. She said, "Ranger, do you know me?" He said nothing. She dropped the bacon in the grass and walked to town. By the time Whitaker got out to the road with two other men, Kilburn had begun slowly to walk again. He was walking toward the sheriff's office. He knew in some way where he was going. He did not respond to questions. He allowed himself to be helped. He allowed himself to be led. They got him into the office. They sat him in the chair by Whitaker's desk. They gave him water, which he drank as though the drinking was something he was remembering how to do. His hands throughout would not stop moving. That was the first thing Whitaker later remembered. The hands. They moved constantly, both of them, in small, precise motions. Little arcs, little diagonals. The wrists would tilt. The fingers would pinch and release, as if he were at every moment gripping and using a small tool nobody else could see. He did not speak for the first 6 hours. At noon, or a little past, he looked directly at Whitaker for the first time. He held Whitaker's eye for what Whitaker afterwards said was the longest 4 or 5 seconds of his life. Then Kilburn said, very clearly, "Paper." Whitaker got him paper. He said, "Pencil, soft." Whitaker got him a pencil. He had to sharpen it. It was the only pencil in the office. Kilburn set the paper on the desk in front of him. He did not at first draw. He sat with the pencil in his right hand and let his left hand rest flat on the paper. He closed his eyes. He was still for perhaps a full minute. It was the only minute in which his hands did not move. From the moment he had returned, then he began. He drew for 6 hours. Whitaker watched almost the entire time. He did not eat. He did not leave the room. He sat opposite Kilburn at the desk with his hands folded, and he watched a man he did not, by the end, believe he knew do something he had never seen a human being do. Kilburn drew with both hands. He did not use them together at first. He used the right hand mostly. The left one hovered close, sometimes tracing the air an inch or two above the paper, as if steadying an image only he could see. But as the hours went on, the left hand began to work too. Sometimes it would take the pencil from the right. Sometimes it would smudge a line the right had drawn, softening it, adjusting a shadow. The right and the left worked in a way that Whitaker later, groping for the right word, called cooperative. He said in his own written account of the day, which is in the county archive, "I have seen 2 men working the same corner of a barn roof, less coordinated than his 2 hands were with each other." It was as if his hands were 2 separate persons, and both of them were very good, and both of them were doing the same drawing. What he drew was a view. That was what Whitaker realized first, watching it come together. He drew a view, a landscape. He drew Cinder Wells and the country around it, seen from up high and slightly to the east. He drew the town first, only an outline, the main street, the 6 standing buildings, the well. He drew with more care than seemed necessary the sheriff's office, down to the crack in the door frame that Whitaker himself had never bothered to fix, down to the exact position of the small square of glass propped in the west window that Whitaker used to see who was coming when the sun was low. He drew the church that did not yet have a bell. Then he drew the country outside the town. He drew the roads leading in. He drew the 2 dry water courses to the east. He drew the stand of cottonwoods, he drew the sun-bleached rise of low stones. He drew everything precisely as it was. Then he drew along each road and out into the flats and on the banks of the dry watercourses and at the base of the low stones, small human figures, 9 of them. At first, Whitaker thought nothing of it. It was, after all, a landscape. Landscapes have people in them. Then, as Kilburn kept working, Whitaker began to lean forward. The first figure was standing on the north road, about a mile out of town. He was on foot. He was not moving toward the town. He was facing away from it. His hands were at his sides. Beside this figure, Kilburn wrote in a small, clean hand the word Trethway. Whitaker did not at that moment react. He said afterward that he had told himself at first that this was a coincidence, a ranger trying to organize his thoughts, laying out the missing men in a picture, as one might lay out chess pieces on a board. The second figure was at the quarry. He was kneeling. His right arm was extended as if reaching for something Kilburn had not drawn yet. His head was turned and his face was in profile, and the profile, Whitaker later said, was clearly Silas Merrick's. Beside him, Kilburn wrote Merrick. The third was on the middle road, to the way station. He was on horseback, but the horse was drawn with unusual care, and the way the man was sitting the horse was very specific, one shoulder lower than the other. The reins held in a way that a preacher who had ridden for years would hold them. Beside him, Kilburn wrote Fen. By this point, Whitaker had stopped telling himself anything. The fourth figure was in a place that had, in Whitaker's memory, no significance, a stretch of open flat about 4 miles south of town. There was nothing there. The man was standing. He was facing the town. His hat in the drawing was on the ground beside him, brim up, as if it had been placed there. Beside him, Kilburn wrote Aldcroft, Osius Aldcroft, missing since August. He had been a surveyor. Whitaker had never known where he had last been seen. The fifth figure was closer to town. He was seated on a stone. His head was in his hands. It was a posture that suggested exhaustion or grief or resignation. Whitaker could not tell. Beside him, Kilburn wrote Holsted, Reuben Holsted, missing since October, a tinsmith, a quiet man. Whitaker had not until that moment known that Holsted ever sat down on stones. The sixth was in the cottonwoods. He was standing very still. His arms were slightly raised. Boaz, Hollis Boaz, cattle drover, missing since June. The seventh figure was on the low stones. He was in a posture that Whitaker did not at first understand. He was drawn as if he were listening to the stones, his ear pressed against the largest of them, his hands flat against the stone on either side of his head. Reich, Cornelius Reich, missing since July. The eighth figure was near the well, right there in the town. On the drawing of Cinder Wells itself, the ninth man who had been lost from the country around it was standing at the very edge of the town well, looking down into it. Pruitt, the horse trader, whose mustangs had been led by a knot tied to nothing. Whitaker at that point put his hand over his mouth and kept it there. He did not speak. Kilburn kept working. He drew at last a ninth figure. This one was different. The other 8 figures were on the ground, on roads, in flats near the town, in places that at least in theory existed. The 9th figure was above them. He was drawn on a small hill, a rise, a modest bump in the terrain, not a mountain, just a low, natural-looking hill, drawn about 3 miles east of Cinder Wells, and drawn from a perspective that would have placed the viewer, the one seeing the drawing, higher still, as if the 9th figure were on the hill, and the artist had been somewhere just above the hill, looking down at all of it. The 9th figure was standing. His arms were at his sides. His head was tilted slightly in what Whitaker later described as the exact position of a man listening for a distant sound. Beside him, Kilburn wrote nothing. He set the pencil down. Whitaker cleared his throat. He said very quietly, "Kilburn, who is that?" Kilburn did not answer for what felt to Whitaker like a very long time. Then he said, "Not who, where?" Whitaker said, "Where?" Kilburn looked at him. Then he said, "That is where he watches from," Whitaker said. "Who?" Kilburn blinked slowly. He looked back down at the drawing and he said in a voice that was almost gentle, "The one who taught me how to draw." Then he put his head down on the desk. He did not get back up under his own power. Whitaker and 2 other men carried him to the cell in the back, which was the only place with a cot, and they laid him on it. And they took his boots off, and they covered him with a blanket. He did not wake that day or the next in the way that a man wakes. He would open his eyes, he would look at the ceiling. He would sometimes move his lips in tiny, precise movements as though tracing lines. His hands throughout did not stop. Whitaker sat with the drawing for the rest of that afternoon and most of the evening. He did not touch the paper. He looked at each figure. He looked at each name. He compared in his memory what he knew of each man's disappearance to what the drawing showed, where each figure was standing, what each figure was doing. In every case, in every single case, the drawing said something about the missing man that Whitaker had not known before that day. He had not known, for instance, that Merrick had knelt. He had not known Fenn had held his reins that way. He had not known Aldcroft had taken off his hat. He had certainly not known that Reich had done anything with the low stones. Kilburn, who had been out in that country for 47 days, might, in theory, have found some of them. Might, in some way that Whitaker could not quite picture, have reconstructed the postures from what he found. But he could not have known, for instance, that Pruitt's Mustangs had come back the way they had come back. That story had not yet reached Kilburn. Pruitt had gone missing while Kilburn was out, and yet Pruitt was in the drawing at the well looking down into it. Whitaker rode out the next morning. He rode to the first location. It was the spot on the north road where the first figure, the one labeled Trethway, had been standing. Whitaker had ridden that stretch of road perhaps 100 times. He had ridden it looking for Trethway. He had ridden it after the wagon had come home without him. He rode to it now with the drawing folded inside his coat, and he stopped where the figure had been standing. He looked to the south. That was the direction the figure had faced. He got off his horse. He walked in a slow widening spiral out from the point on the road. 10 paces from the road, in a small depression he had never noticed, he found a coat button, a brass one, the kind Trethway had used to sew back on his freighting coat, one by one when they popped off. 20 paces further out, in a stand of low grass, he found the freighter's tobacco pouch, empty, dry, cracked. 40 paces further out, in the shade of a mesquite, he found what was left of Amos Trethway. He did not describe in his report what he found there. He wrote only that the freighter had been located, that there was no doubt as to the identification, that the remains were treated with the respect due a man who had been lost, and that a marker had been placed. He rode back to town that evening in a state of quiet that his deputy, meeting him at the stable, said he had never seen on the sheriff before. The next day, Whitaker rode to the second location, the quarry. He walked with the drawing in his hand to the spot where the figure of Merrick had been kneeling. He knelt himself in the same posture. He extended his right arm as the drawing had, and let his hand fall where the figure's hand had fallen. His fingers touched something in the dust. It was Merrick's small stone hammer, the one his brother had given him. It had been buried, or fabried, or perhaps only very carefully covered, and it was there at the exact point on the ground where the drawn hand had reached. 6 paces further on, in a shallow gully, he found the rest. He wrote home. He did this 8 times. Over the course of 11 days, he went to every location on the drawing that corresponded to a named figure. He went to the middle road, to the flat south of town, to the stone Holstead had sat on, to the cottonwoods, to the low, sun-bleached rise to the edge of the well. In each of those places he found something, sometimes very little, sometimes only a marker of what had once been a man. The last one was the hardest. He did not want to go to the well. He went in the small hours of one morning alone with a lantern. He held the lantern out over the mouth of the well, and he looked down. He did not describe what he saw. He wrote only in his report, "We have accounted for Pruitt as well. May the Lord have mercy on us." The drawing had told the truth about all 8 of them. There was, however, a 9th figure on the hill. There was no hill. Whitaker rode out to the place on the drawing where the hill should have been, 3 miles, due east of Cinder Wells and slightly north. The country there was flat. It had a slight, almost imperceptible rise in the western portion of it, no more than a foot or 2, the sort of rise a wagon wheel would not notice. Otherwise it was open scrub, cactus, ocotillo, loose gravel, nothing that could, by any stretch of a man's eye, be called a hill. He walked its length. He walked its breadth. He rode it in a slow spiral. At noon, at dusk, at dawn, he returned to it in fog. He returned to it in a thin rain. There was no hill. There was no place on that flat, no matter where he stood. from which the town of Cinder Wells could be seen at the angle the drawing showed. To see the town from the angle the drawing showed, he would have had to be at least 60 feet above the ground. There was quite simply nowhere to stand. He went back to the office. He looked at the drawing again. The ninth figure was still there, standing on his impossible hill, his arms at his sides, his head tilted in that slight listening way. Whitaker went to the cell. Kilburn was awake. He was by then, sometimes, almost conversant. Not for long. His mind wandered off in the middle of any exchange, but sometimes briefly he could focus on a question and give an answer that made sense in the language of ordinary men. Whitaker sat on the edge of the cot. He said, "Ephraim." Kilburn's eyes moved to him. Whitaker said, "The hill in the drawing where you drew that ninth man. There is no hill there." Kilburn blinked. He said, "No." Whitaker said, "But there was." Kilburn said, "There is." Whitaker said, "Where?" Kilburn looked at the ceiling. He was quiet for a while. His hands on his chest kept moving. Then he said, "You do not see it because you have not been where I have been." Whitaker said, "Where were you, Ephraim?" Kilburn said, "In the place where you can see it from." Whitaker said, "You were 47 days out. Where were you?" Kilburn turned his head slowly to look at him. He said, "I was on the hill." Whitaker said, "For 47 days." Kilburn said, "No." He said, "I was on the hill for one afternoon." He said, "After that I was learning to draw." Whitaker sat with that for a long time. He said at last, "Who taught you?" Kilburn's eyes went unfocused. His mouth moved a little in tiny, deliberate ways, as if forming small shapes he did not intend to make sounds out of. His hands kept moving. Then he said, "He watches from that hill. He does not come down. He does not need to." Then he said quietly, "You will not find him in the place where the hill would be. He is not in the country. He is in the drawing." Whitaker went cold in a way that he later said had nothing to do with the weather. He said, "Ephraim, the hill in the drawing. What is it?" Kilburn, without any change of tone, said, "It is the place from which the drawing is made." Then he closed his eyes. He did not speak again in a way that Whitaker could make useful sense of. He lived in that cell for the better part of 5 months. He would eat if fed. He would drink. He would sit sometimes in the chair by the small barred window and look out at the light. He would allow himself to be shaved. He would allow himself to be walked once a day in the backyard behind the office. His hands never stopped. Whitaker at some point in December gave him paper. It was, in retrospect, perhaps not the wise thing. Kilburn drew. He drew first the same drawing, Cinder Wells, the roads, the dry water courses, the 9 figures, the 8 names, the impossible hill. Whitaker took it, he compared it to the first one. It was identical, not similar. Identical to the width of a hair, to the placement of every mark. Whitaker had not thought a human being could do such a thing twice. He had certainly not thought a human being could do it twice, weeks apart, with the same hand. Kilburn drew it again the next day, identical. He drew it every day for the rest of December and into January and into February, or nearly identical, because on some days Whitaker noticed there were tiny changes. On one day, in the middle of December, there was a 10th figure. The 10th figure was on the main street of Cinder Wells, standing outside the sheriff's office, facing the door, his hands at his sides. His head tilted slightly in the same listening posture as the 9th. Whitaker looked at the 10th figure. He looked at the way the 10th figure was drawn, and he saw, without the aid of a mirror, that the 10th figure was him. Beside the 10th figure, Kilburn had written quite clearly, "Whitaker." Whitaker did not eat that day. He hid that particular version of the drawing at the back of a shelf. The next day's drawing had no 10th figure. It was the original 9. Whitaker looked at it for a long time. He compared it from memory to the one from the day before, and he found that the day before's drawing in his memory had been perfectly ordinary. He had to go and dig the hidden one out from behind the shelf to convince himself again that he had not imagined the 10th figure. He did not for a long time know what to do with that knowledge. In January, Kilburn drew a version in which the 8th figure at the well was no longer Pruitt. The name beside him was Kilburn. The next day it was Pruitt again. The day after it was blank. The day after that it was Whitaker. Whitaker began to keep the drawings in a strongbox. He counted 43 of them by the middle of February. Toward the end of that month, Kilburn stopped drawing. He simply stopped. One morning he did not reach for the paper. He sat with his hands folded in his lap. He looked calmly at the wall. His hands were still. For the first time since he had returned, his hands were still. He died 3 nights later. The doctor who examined the body said at the time that Ephraim Kilburn had died in his sleep of natural causes consistent with a man of his age who had, quote, exhausted himself. The doctor was a decent, plain-thinking country practitioner, and he did not believe in the sort of things Kilburn had drawn, and he did not want to. He signed the certificate. He went home. Whitaker did not sleep for 2 nights after Kilburn died. He sat at his desk with the strongbox open in front of him. He did not look again at all of the drawings. He was afraid, he wrote later, that he would see himself in more of them than he could bear to. He selected one, the first one, the original, the one Kilburn had drawn on the day he came back. He wrapped it in oilcloth. He placed it in an inner drawer of his safe. He locked the safe, he burned the others, or he tried to. He said in the note he left with the original drawing that when he had tried to burn the copies, the copies had not burned in the ordinary manner. The paper had blackened, the paper had crumpled, but when he raked the ashes with a stick to be sure that it had gone all the way, he had found at the bottom of the ash pile some pieces that had refused to blacken. The pieces, he wrote, were the pieces on which the 9th figure had been drawn. He said in the note, I have buried those. I have not looked at where I buried them since. If you find this note, do not look either. He wrote the note in June of 1868 in a hand that his deputies later said was by that point no longer quite the sheriff's ordinary hand. He kept the note with the drawing. He went on with his life. He did not, according to any surviving record, ever mention the drawing to anyone else in the town again. He served for 4 more years. He died in office in the winter of 1872. He was found at his desk in the morning by the same deputy who had noticed the odd handwriting. He was slumped forward, his head on his folded arms as if he had lain down to think. The safe was closed. The strongbox was closed. His revolver was in his belt. His hands were flat on the desk in front of him. They were absolutely still. The doctor again called it natural causes. The doctor was by then a different doctor. The drawing was found in the safe exactly where Whitaker had left it, wrapped in oilcloth with the note. The county did not at that time know what to do with it. It was placed in the county archive. It sat in a small tin box for the better part of 30 years. It was moved in 1903 when the archive was reorganized into a folder with the label Cinder Wells Case File, though by that time Cinder Wells itself had shrunk to 2 standing buildings and by 1912 was gone from most maps. In 1922, the folder was transferred to a small museum in Austin dedicated to the history of the ranger companies. It was catalogued there briefly as Item 6111, Unlabeled Landscape. At some point in the 1930s, an archivist unfolded it in front of 2 colleagues for a routine assessment, and one of the colleagues, a man of about 40 years old, later took an early retirement and never spoke publicly about the reason. By the 1940s, the item had been reclassified. It was listed from then on as material sensitive to study. Its file was moved into an inner storeroom. It is, so far as any published record indicates, still there. It is not on display. The only description of it that appears in any modern reference is a single line in an internal catalog compiled in 1955, which reads in full, a pencil landscape of a small West Texas town and surrounding country, presenting significant perspective anomalies, discouraged for prolonged viewing. The 2 people over the years who have described the drawing in writing after examining it both describe the same thing. They describe a landscape that they cannot look at for more than a few minutes at a time. They describe an odd feeling that a small figure at the top of the drawing, standing on a hill they cannot make sense of, is looking not out from the drawing but into it. They describe a feeling that the town in the drawing is being watched. They describe, in slightly different words, but with the same substance, a feeling that they are looking at it, being watched. They describe, both of them, in almost identical phrasing at the end of their reports, that the hill in the drawing seems, when they look at it too long, to be very slightly closer to the town than it was when they first began looking. Neither of them writes a follow-up report. I'm going to leave the story there, not because it ends there, But because a story like this one, if I am honest, does not really end, it just gets put in a drawer and moved to a shelf and quietly reclassified and left where it can be left. Because nobody who has looked at it long enough has quite been able to think about it afterward the way they thought about things before. Ephraim Kilburn came back from those 47 days having learned how to draw. He drew a view of a small town from a place that does not exist. And in that view, everyone who was already gone was in his right place. And in that view, over time, more figures came in. Figures that had not yet been drawn. Figures that were still walking around. Cassius Whitaker was one of those figures. I would very much like to believe I am not. You would very much like to believe you are not. The trouble with a drawing like that, the real trouble, is that it does not, so far as anyone has been able to say, matter what you believe. It has already been drawn. If you have listened to me all the way down here into the dark, I want to ask you before you close this window and turn the lights back on to do two small things. Tell me in the comments whether you have ever in your life felt the feeling I described. That flat, quiet certainty that you were being watched. Not from a window, not from a doorway, from somewhere you could not quite have looked at if you had tried. Tell me a time, tell me where you were, and if you would like to sit longer in this kind of dark, what the mountain keeps is waiting for you. The link is in the description. The link is pinned in the comments. 10 complete cases, every one of them a file the law closed with the wrong word. Every one of them a piece of country that took a man and gave back only what he had been wearing. If this story stayed with you, subscribe so the next one finds you. And if you are hearing me somewhere that is not called Macabre Story, this recording did not choose to be there. Somebody put it there. If you tell us where, we will thank you. For tonight, sleep in a well-lit room, close the curtain if it is dark outside, and if you have any piece of paper on your desk on which you have in the last week drawn anything at all, even absently, even without meaning to look at it, count the figures.